Picture this. A wet afternoon in the middle of October, the long drive at Ravensmere freshly raked and shining with rain, and a hired post-chaise coming up between the elms with a crest painted on its door that had never been paid for. Inside it sat a man of 50, who had once been called the handsomest duke in 3 counties, and beside him a woman in a travelling gown of plum silk that had been the height of fashion 6 years earlier. Both of them had spent the last 30 miles of that journey rehearsing, silently and separately, the exact face they intended to wear when the doors of the house opened. 10 years. That was how long it had been since Gideon Devereux, Duke of Ravensmere, had gone down that same drive in the opposite direction without once turning his head to look back, and in 10 years a man can convince himself of almost anything, including the idea that a house holds its breath in his absence. He had prepared himself for tears, and more grandly for coldness, because coldness would at least have been a kind of attention, and attention was the one currency Gideon Devereux had never in his life had to earn. What he had not prepared himself for was what actually happened, which was nothing. The chaise stopped. No bell rang. No line of servants came out to form itself on the gravel. A boy of about 14 came round from the stable yard, looked at the horses with the professional pity of someone who knows a hired team when he sees one, and asked whether the gentleman wanted them watered, and when the Duke said, rather too loudly, that he was not a gentleman but the Duke of Ravensmere, the boy said he would fetch someone who would know about that. The front door was already open. It had been open all afternoon, because there were men in the east wing laying new pipe, and they had been carrying lengths of it through the hall since noon. So the Duke of Ravensmere walked into his own house unannounced, and stood in the smell of whetstone and sawdust with the woman in plum silk a half-step behind him, and nobody so much as broke stride. And there by the great fireplace, on a flat-woven rug worn thin at one corner, lay an enormous grey deerhound, so old now that his muzzle had gone entirely white, and his hips had the careful, folded look of hips that hurt in the wet. The Duke saw him, and something in his chest gave way, because here at last was the thing he had come home certain of. He had raised that dog from a whelp that fitted inside his coat, and he had carried a picture in his mind across 10 years and 2 countries of that grey dog crossing a floor to him at a run. "Bran," he said. The hound raised his head. "Bran," the Duke said again, and his voice cracked in a way that made the woman in plum silk look at him with something close to contempt. And the old dog looked back at him steadily out of clouded eyes with an expression that every person in that hall recognized, and that the Duke himself was the last to understand. It was interest. Mild, incurious, well-mannered interest, the look a house dog gives a stranger who has come in out of the rain. There was no leap, no whine, no shiver of recognition running down that long grey back. Bran considered him for the space of 3 heartbeats, the way he considered the pipe layers and the corn factor and anybody else who came through the door on business, and then he got up, slowly, 4 legs first because of the hips, shook himself once, and walked past the Duke of Ravensmere without touching him. He crossed the flagstones to the foot of the staircase, where a broad, weather-browned man in a plain brown coat stood with a roll of drawings under one arm, and lay down on that man's boots with a groan of pure contentment and shut his eyes. "He was my dog," the Duke said. He did not say it to anyone in particular. He said it to the room, the way a man says a thing that has just stopped being true. And from the turn of the stairs where she had come out at the sound of a strange voice with her sleeves pushed up and ink on the side of her hand, the Duchess of Ravensmere looked down at her husband for the first time in 10 years and answered him without any cruelty at all, which was somehow worse. He was, she said. He waited at that gate for 11 days. Then he stopped. If you have ever gone back to a place you left, sure in your bones that it had been standing still and waiting for you, and found instead that it had gone on and gone on and gone on and become something that no longer had a shape in it that fitted you, then you already know exactly what the Duke of Ravensmere felt standing in the wet sawdust of his own hall. Before we go on, do this for me. Hit subscribe and leave a comment telling us what part of the world you are watching from tonight, because these stories travel further than any of us expect. And give the video a like if you believe a woman is owed more than the patience she is told to show. Because what the Duke is about to learn over the next hour is that he did not come home too late by an afternoon or a season. He came home 10 years late to a life that had healed over the exact shape of him, so completely that not even the dog he raised had kept a place for him in it. And to understand how that happened, we have to go back to the beginning, to a marriage that was arranged over a table like a shipment of wool, and to the morning a very young woman from Leeds first saw the house that would take her 20 years to make into a home. Rosalind Marchbank was 22 years old when her father sold her, though nobody at the time used that word. And to be fair to Josiah Marchbank, he genuinely believed he was buying her something. He was a wool man out of Leeds, 3 mills and a dye works and a temper he kept in a box, and he had made in one generation the sort of money that in England buys everything except the one thing it is spent on, which is being let in. The Duke of Ravensmere had the opposite problem. He had a name that went back to the conquest, a house with 11 chimneys and a roof that ate money like a furnace, an income that had been quietly halving itself for 40 years, and debts held in London by men who had begun to write to him in a tone he did not care for. The negotiation took 9 days. Rosalind was present for one of them, seated at the end of a table with her hands in her lap while 2 men discussed the size of her settlement, the terms of her jointure, and the number of years before her father's money would begin to appear in the Ravensmere accounts, and she remembered afterwards that at no point in the whole afternoon had anyone asked her a single question. She married Gideon Devereux in the spring of that year in a church so cold that the ink froze in the register and had to be thawed over a candle before she could sign her name. He was 30 then, and beautiful in the way certain English aristocrats are beautiful, which is to say that his face had never had to fight for anything, and it showed. He was faultlessly polite to her. That was the part nobody warned her about. She had braced herself for cruelty and got courtesy instead, which turns out to be much harder to complain of and much harder to live in. He said good morning. He said the weather looked settled. He asked whether she had everything she required, and when she said yes, he was visibly relieved and went out. In their first year of marriage, she counted the sentences he addressed to her that were not about arrangements, and by December she had reached 9. Ravensmere in those days was a magnificent, freezing, dying thing. 11 chimneys and only 4 of them ever lit. Damp climbing the north wall of the long gallery like a tide mark. 43 tenant farms, of which 11 were in arrears and 4 were empty because the roofs had gone, and nobody had thought it worth the outlay to put them back. Rosalind had grown up in a house where her father read the mill books aloud at breakfast and made his children do the sums, and so in the second month of her marriage she asked the steward whether she might see the estate accounts. Faraday was old and not corrupt, only very tired, and he thought the request charming the way a puppy is charming, and gave them to her. She sat with them for 4 days. Then she asked why the home farm was buying oats when the West Fields had grown oats for 200 years, and Faraday said that was simply how it had come to be done. She began quietly to unpick it. She learned the difference between a rack rent and a beneficial lease, and she learned riding out in a plain wool cloak in weather her sisters-in-law would not have crossed a courtyard in, which tenants were behind because they were idle, and which because a bad drain had drowned 2 seasons of their labour, and that these were almost never the same men. Within 4 years the arrears were halved. Within 6 the West Fields were in oats again, and the mill at Nether Cray, which had stood idle since her husband's father's day, was turning. She did all of this without ever once being thanked, because her husband did not notice it, and she did not tell him, because she had learned by then not to offer her opinion. That was the phrase she used to herself, privately, in the dark. Do not offer, wait to be asked. She was asked perhaps twice a year. There were no children. That was the wound under all the others, and it was a quiet one, and it had a way of turning up in rooms where nobody had mentioned it, in the shape of a cousin's christening or a dowager's sigh or a doctor from London who examined her twice and charged a great deal and said nothing useful. Gideon never reproached her for it. He simply began, somewhere around their 5th year, to be elsewhere. And it was in that 5th year, on a wet March morning with the yard full of straw, that a wagon came up from Argyll with 2 rough-coated wolfhound whelps in a crate, bought by the Duke on a whim from a man he had met at a shooting party. He kept the dog, the bitch he gave away within the month, because she chewed a boot. The dog he called Bran, after the hound in the old story that could outrun any deer in Ireland, and for 1 whole winter Gideon Devereux was a man Rosalind almost recognised, out in the wet fields, with a great gangling grey puppy tripping over its own feet, teaching it to sit at the sound of a glove being drawn off, laughing out loud in the cold. She used to watch them from the gallery window. She would tell herself it was foolish to feel jealous of a dog, and then feel it anyway, and then feel ashamed, and then go back to the ledgers. But that same winter she began to walk out with them, and Bran, who was too young to understand rank, decided somewhere in his puppy skull that the tall, quiet woman who came with them was part of the arrangement, and by the following spring he slept across her bedroom door every night of his life. Gideon thought this was funny. He said the dog had no discernment. It was, Rosalind reflected many years later, the single most accurate thing her husband ever said, and he had meant it entirely as a joke. Lady Camilla Ferrers arrived in the county the summer Rosalind turned 30, and she arrived the way weather arrives, with everybody remarking on it for a week beforehand. She was the widow of a baronet who had left her a house she could not afford and a reputation she could, and what she had, more than beauty, was the gift of making a man feel that he had just said something remarkable. She took the Duke of Ravensmere apart in about 4 months, in full view of 40 families, and she was so good at it that half of them believed for a long while that nothing was happening at all. Rosalind knew in September. Not from a letter, not from a servant, not from any of the ways such things are supposed to be discovered. She knew because her husband came home from Ferrers Lodge one evening and told her, unprompted and at length, about a conversation he had had there concerning the drainage of the lower meadows, and it was the first time in 11 years of marriage that he had ever volunteered a piece of his day to her. Guilt makes men chatty. She noted it. She said the meadows had wanted drainage since his father's time. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed with her hands perfectly still in her lap and did not cry, because she had discovered years earlier that crying in that house simply produced a headache and a maid with a bowl of water, and neither of those had ever once altered a single fact. What followed was not a romance, and it was not even in the end a scandal. It was a slow, methodical transfer of goods. That is what nobody tells you about this kind of betrayal. It is not the perfume on the coat that finishes you, it is the inventory. In November, a note appeared in the household accounts for a pair of carriage horses purchased at Doncaster and delivered, the entry said, to the lodge. In January, the Duke's London Bank sent a routine acknowledgment of a standing quarterly payment to an account in the name of C. Ferrers, and the acknowledgment was addressed to the Duke. But the Duke was in London, and so it was opened by his wife, who had opened his estate post for 6 years with his indifferent permission. In March, the jeweller at Ripon wrote to confirm that the garnets had been reset as instructed. Rosalind read that letter 3 times. The garnets had come to her from her mother, who had had them from her own mother, a dour Yorkshire woman who had worn them to chapel and to 2 funerals and nowhere else. They were not fine stones. They were not worth, in money, 1/10 of what the Ravensmere diamonds were worth. They were the only objects in that entire house that were hers by blood rather than by title, and they had been taken out of her dressing-room, carried to Ripon, prized out of their old dull setting, and remade into a modern spray for a woman who could not have named Rosalind's mother if she had been paid for it. She went to her husband about that one. It was the only time she ever went to him about any of it. She stood in the door of the library with the jeweller's letter in her hand, and she asked him, plainly and without heat, whether he had given away her mother's garnets. And Gideon Devereux, who was not a cruel man so much as a man who had never once had to sit inside a consequence, looked up from his newspaper with an expression of mild irritation at being interrupted, and said that they were old-fashioned and nobody wore them, that Camilla had admired them, and that he had not thought Rosalind would mind since she never wore jewels anyway, and that in any case everything in this house was ultimately his. Then he asked her, in the same breath, whether the Nethercray books had been made up for the quarter. She said they had. She went out. She walked the length of the long gallery and down the stairs and out through the side door into the kitchen garden. And the old grey dog came off the flags and fell in beside her without being called, the way he had for 6 years. And she walked the wall of that garden 4 times in the dark with one hand on his head. This, she said to him at last, out loud, because there was nobody else in England she could say it to, is not a broken heart. A broken heart I could manage. I have been managing one of those since the ink froze in the register. This is theft, and a man who will take a dead woman's garnets off her daughter's shelf to please a living woman's vanity will take the rest of it too in time, and he will not even think of it as taking. He will think of it as tidying. The hound leaned his shoulder into her thigh, which was all he had, and it was more than she had been given by any human creature in that house in 11 years. She stood in the wet cabbage rows, and she looked up at the 11 chimneys of Ravensmere, 4 of them smoking, and she began to think about paper. The end, when it came in June, and it came with luggage. Rosalind came back from Nether Cray at 4 in the afternoon to find the hall full of trunks, corded and labelled, and a travelling coach in the yard being loaded by 2 footmen who would not look at her. Her husband was in the library with the door ajar and a lamp lit against the gloom of a wet summer evening, and Camilla Ferrers was in there with him, and Rosalind stopped in the passage outside because she heard her own name. It is a strange thing to hear yourself discussed by people who believe you are 2 miles away, and stranger still to find that the version of you they carry between them is not a wicked woman or a hated woman, but a piece of furniture. She will not make trouble, her husband was saying. That is the beauty of Rosalind. She has never made trouble in her life. She will keep the books and mind the tenants and be perfectly correct about the whole business, and in a year the county will have decided she prefers it this way. Camilla laughed, low and easy, and said something about how convenient it was to marry a woman with a talent for arithmetic, since a wife who can keep accounts is very nearly as good as an agent and costs a great deal less. And then she said, and Rosalind heard every syllable of it through 4 inches of open door, that she supposed the dog would have to be dealt with, because she would not have that great grey creature moulting in a carriage all the way to Dover. There was a pause. Rosalind, in the dark of the passage, discovered that she was holding the edge of a console table hard enough to hurt. And then her husband said, in the pleasant, reasonable, unbothered voice he used for settling small domestic matters, that the dog could stop where he was. He is more hers than mine these days, in any case, Gideon said. Let him stay and be company for her. Rosalind was always better with things that cannot answer back. That was the sentence. 10 years later, at the assizes and after, people in that county would repeat a good many lines out of this story, but that was the one Rosalind carried. The way you carry a stone in a shoe all the way to the end. She did not go in. She did not scream. She did not stand in the doorway and demand an explanation, because she had understood in the 2 seconds after that sentence one absolutely clarifying thing. There was no explanation to be had. A man does not explain a decision he has not noticed himself making. She went up the back stairs, changed out of her wet things, came down at 6, and stood in the hall while the last of the trunks went out. Gideon told her he would be abroad for some months, that Marl would see to the estate, that she should apply to Marl for anything she needed. He was already wearing his travelling coat. He kissed her hand, cool and correct as always, and it occurred to Rosalind, in the moment his lips touched her knuckles, that this was the 6th time in 11 years that her husband had voluntarily touched her. Camilla Ferrers came down the staircase in a green cloak, gave Rosalind a smile of such flawless sisterly sympathy that 2 of the maids afterwards said they had felt cold, and said how well she was looking. And then they went out to the coach, and Bran went with them. That is the part Rosalind never afterwards spoke about, except once, in Chancery Lane, to a solicitor who required it for a deposition. The old dog followed his master out into the yard, wagging, delighted, certain, and he ran alongside the coach as it turned, and he ran down the drive after it under the elms, and when it went out through the gates and turned onto the Ripon Road at a trot he was still running. He was 5 years old and in his strength. He kept up for the better part of a mile. Somewhere past the second milestone he went under the offside wheel or into the ditch beside it, nobody ever established which, and the coachman did not stop, because he had not been told to stop, and the man in the coach did not look back, because he never did. Rosalind found him at 9 that night, 1.25 miles down the Ripon Road, the front leg broken in 2 places and his eyes white with pain, lying in the wet grass facing the way the coach had gone. She sat down in the ditch in her good grey dress and put his head in her lap and told him, over and over, in a voice she barely recognised, that it was all right, that they would go home now, that she had him. That is where she was, and that is what she was doing. When the man in the plain brown coat came down the road with a lantern and a horse doctor's bag and asked whether he might have a look at that leg. His name was Nathaniel Ardley. He had come into the district that spring as a land agent, though half his work turned out to be doctoring horses, and he had been at the Fenwick farm since morning with a mare that was foaling badly. He did not ask who she was. That was the first thing Rosalind noticed about him, sitting in a wet ditch at 9 at night with a stranger's lantern on the grass between them. He asked whether the dog bit when he was frightened, and she said not yet. And he said in that case would she keep hold of his head and talk to him, because the noise of her voice would do more good than anything in the bag. He splinted the leg there in the ditch with 2 lengths of hazel and a strip cut from his own shirt, and then he carried 60 pounds of wolfhound 1.25 miles up the Ripon Road and through the gates of Ravensmere without once suggesting that a footman be fetched, and he laid him down on the kitchen flags by the range and set the bone properly at 11 o'clock at night with Mrs. Redfern, the housekeeper, holding a candle in each hand. When it was done, he washed at the scullery pump and said the leg would knit, but that the dog would feel it in cold weather for the rest of his life, and Rosalind said that a great many of them would. And Nathaniel Ardley looked at her for a moment and did not say anything at all, which she found she preferred. He would not take money. He said he would take his fee out of the estate in the ordinary way if her Grace ever wanted the lower meadows drained, since somebody plainly ought to. Bran was 6 weeks on 3 legs, and every one of the first 11 of those days, as soon as the kitchen door was opened in the morning, he dragged himself down the drive to the gates and lay there facing the Ripon Road, and would not come in, and would not eat, and had to be carried back at dusk. On the 12th day he did not go. Rosalind watched from the gallery window as he came out into the yard, stood a while, looked once down the drive, and then turned and went round the back of the house to where the sun was on the wall, and lay down there instead. It was the first honest lesson anybody in that house had given her in 11 years, and it had been given by a dog. A creature can love you entirely and wait for you faithfully and still at a certain point simply stop. Not out of anger, not out of spite, out of the plain animal knowledge that you are not coming, and that the sun is warm on the south wall, and that life is short. It took Rosalind about a fortnight longer than the dog, which she always afterwards considered a fair measure of the difference between a hound and a duchess. She did not write to her husband. She did not write to Camilla Ferrers. What she did on the last morning of June was take a plain deal box out of the estate office, set it on her own desk in her own sitting room, and begin to fill it. Because here is the thing that Rosalind Devereux understood. Sitting alone in that enormous cold house with a lame dog under her chair, that a great many wronged women never get told. An accusation without proof is a gift to the man you are accusing. It hands him the high ground. It lets him be patient with you in public. It lets the county say, "Poor creature, she has taken it hard," and go on inviting him to dinner. Proof is different. Proof does not require anybody to believe her. Proof simply sits on a table and is what it is. She began with dates. Every quarterly payment to the account in the name of seafarers, copied out in her own hand, with the bank's own acknowledgment pinned beside it. The bill from the jeweller at Ripon for the resetting of the garnets. The Doncaster horse dealer's receipt. The household ledger showing the transfer of £240 to an account she could not identify in the week before the coach went to Dover. Then she wrote to a solicitor, not to the family firm in York, who would have had a letter on its way to her husband before the ink was dry, but to a man in London named Elias Fenn, who had done years of unglamorous work for her father's mills, and had once told Josiah Marchbank to his face that he was wrong about a contract, which was the only reference Rosalind required. Fenn came north in August. He was a small, grey, unimpressed man who ate almost nothing and asked questions in an order that seemed random until you saw the shape of it 3 hours later. He listened to the whole of it without interrupting once. Then he set down his cup and said the sentence that organized the next 4 years of her life. "Your Grace," he said, "you have a choice between complaining regularly and acting once. Complaining is cheaper, and it feels better, and it never ends. If you would rather act once, completely, and never need to act again, then it will take you years, and it will be dull, and you must not say a single sharp word to anybody in this county in the whole of that time." Rosalind said that she had been not saying sharp words for 11 years, and that it was the one skill her marriage had actually taught her. Fenn permitted himself something that was very nearly a smile, and asked for a room and a candle and every scrap of paper she had. The strange thing about building a case in a great house is that you do not go looking for allies. They come to you, one at a time, and they come because of things you did years earlier without any idea that you were doing them. Mrs. Ivy Redfern had been housekeeper at Ravensmere for 26 years, and she came to Rosalind in September with a locked tin box and a face like a closed door. Inside the box were 41 letters. Some of them were letters between Lady Camilla Ferrers and Mr. Simeon Marle, the steward, which had been thrown into the library fire without being pushed properly under the coals, and which Mrs. Redfern had raked out with the tongs and dried on the airing rack because, she said, a letter that somebody has taken the trouble to burn badly is a letter worth keeping. Some were her own copies of household orders that Marle had countermanded, and one, folded very small, was a bill for a christening gown paid by the Duke in the 4th year of his marriage, for a child born in Doncaster to a woman whose name was not Camilla and not Rosalind. Mrs. Redfern said she had never shown that one to a living soul. Rosalind said she would not use it, and never did, which Fenn considered an error, and Rosalind considered the one luxury she permitted herself in 4 years. Then there was Mr. Gedge. Gedge was a thin, coughing clerk at the bank at Ripon, and 8 years earlier the Duchess of Ravensmere had noticed that the boy who brought out the quarterly papers was walking 6 miles each way in bad boots, and had written to the bank offering to pay for a gig herself rather than see it continue. She had forgotten it within a month. Gedge had not. He came to Ravensmere on his own half-day in October, sat on the edge of a chair with his hat in his hands, and said that as a clerk he was bound to discretion, but that the bank kept duplicate advices of transfers between accounts, and that if a court ever asked for them they would have to be produced, and that in his own judgment somebody ought to know that money leaving the Ravensmere rents was not going where the Ravensmere books said it was going. He would not say more. He did not have to. Fenn wrote 3 lines on a card, and Gedge took it away, and 18 months later a subpoena landed on that bank, and every duplicate advice for 6 years came out of the strong room in one bundle. The tenants came in their own way, which was slower and much less legal. Old Hesketh at Marrow Ing, whose lease Rosalind had rewritten in her 4th year so that a bad flood year did not cost a family its home, sent his son up with a note to say that Mr. Marle had been round asking questions about who signed what and when, and that he had answered nothing until he had asked her Grace what she wanted him to answer. 4 of the Nethercray mill hands remembered and would swear to the exact week that the new bookkeeping had come in. And in November, when the frost was on the park, the Dowager Duchess Honoria came down from her own house at Kestrel Cross, in a carriage that was 40 years old, and had her son's crest on the door, and asked for tea and got straight to it. Honoria Devereux had never been warm to her daughter-in-law. She had opposed the marriage, had described Josiah Marchbank's money in a letter as smelling of sheep, and had spent 11 years being flawlessly civil to Rosalind at Christmas. She sat down in the small parlour, refused cake, and said, "I am told my son has taken that Ferrers woman to Dover, that he has left you here to keep his books for nothing, and that a man of business I have never met is now signing leases on land my husband's family held before there was a parliament to hold it in." Rosalind said that all 3 of those things were true. The Dowager put her cup down and said, "Then let us understand one another. I do not love you. I have not troubled to. But I am 81 years old, and the name on that gate will outlast every person now breathing in this county, and my son is spending it on a woman who will drop him the day the money stops. You appear to be the only creature within 30 miles who is behaving as though Ravensmere is worth anything. Tell me what you require." What Rosalind required was a witness of unimpeachable rank who could testify to the family settlements, and she got one. And she also got, though neither of them ever said so, the first person to be on her side in 11 years without needing to be asked twice. That was the winter Rosalind stopped calling it his house. Meanwhile, quite separately from the box of paper, something else was happening at Ravensmere, and it was happening in the fields. Nathaniel Ardley had drained the lower meadows by the following spring, because somebody plainly ought to, and having drained them he stayed to see what came up, and having seen what came up he was still there in the autumn arguing with the Duchess about liming. He treated her from the first hour to the last as a colleague. He brought her figures and expected her to check them. He told her twice in the first year that she was wrong, once about a rent and once about a horse, and both times he turned out to be right, and both times he said so without triumph and moved on. He never once called her poor lady. He never once looked at her with that soft, appalling county pity that made her want to break plates. He had a way of listening with his head slightly down that she found, after a while, that she arranged her days around. They rebuilt the Nether Cray mill together in the 3rd year. They put in a 2nd wheel, took on 19 more hands, and by the 5th year that mill was the reason 4 families in the valley had shoes. They put roofs back on the 4 abandoned farms. They pulled down the ruinous orangery, which had cost £110 a year to keep glass in, and used the stone for cottages, and the county said that was a shocking piece of vandalism for about a year, and then stopped saying it. And every one of those days, from the kitchen door at dawn to the fire at night, the great grey hound went with them, hitching in the cold weather on the leg Ardley had set, choosing, when they sat down, whose feet to lie on with the terrible frankness of dogs. There was a night in the 4th winter when Ardley told her the rest of it. It came out with great reluctance, over a spread of drainage plans, because Fenn had written to say that a barrister acting for the other side had begun asking who exactly this land agent was. And Ardley said that in that case there was something Her Grace had better hear from him rather than from a barrister. His name was Nathaniel Ardley Kestrel. His father had been the 4th Baron Kestrel-Mere, and his elder brother the 5th, and both were dead, the brother of a fever in Lisbon 11 years earlier. Which meant, though he had never once used it and had not answered the letters from the family solicitors in 6 years, that he had been the 6th Baron Kestrel-Mere since he was 27 years old. He said it the way another man might confess to a debt. He said that he had watched his father spend a title like a banknote, that everything he had ever been given as a Kestrel had come with a bill attached, and that when he took the name Ardley and went to learn drainage from a Dutch engineer at Boston in Lincolnshire, it was the first time in his life he had been thanked for something he had actually done. He said he had not told her because he had wanted, for once, to be valued for the work. And then, with his eyes on the plans, he said the rest. That he had loved her since the 2nd winter, and had never intended to say so, because she had a husband in Dover, and a case in London, and a house on her back, and a woman carrying all 3 does not need a man adding to the load, that he would go, if she wished it, and finish the drainage first, because the drainage was not her fault. Rosalind sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Ardley, in 11 years of marriage my husband never once asked my opinion about anything that mattered, and in 4 years you have never once told me a thing without asking mine. I am not free. I do not know when I will be free, or whether the law will ever let me be. But I will not have you go, and I will not have you pretend, and if you can bear to wait for a woman who cannot promise you a date, then stay and lime the top field." He stayed. They did not touch each other for another 2 years, because Fenn had been very clear about what a barrister could do with a rumour, and because both of them had a horror of giving Gideon Devereux a single true thing to say. But the old dog, who had no notion of the law of criminal conversation, slept between their 2 chairs every evening of those 2 years with the deep, uncomplicated contentment of an animal who has decided which people are his. It was Fenn who found the shape of the thing, and he found it the dull way, by reading 4 years of bank advices in order. The money leaving Ravensmere did not go to Dover. That was the discovery that turned a sordid domestic story into a criminal one. A part of it went to Dover, certainly, enough to keep a duke and a lady in rooms and horses, and to pay a Calais hotel that eventually sued for the rest. But the greater part of the Ravensmere rents collected by Mr. Simeon Marl in the Duke's name under a power of attorney the Duke had signed in the yard on the evening he left without reading past the first line, went into a concern called the Kestrel Valley Land Company, registered in Leeds, capital £900, 2 directors. One director was Simeon Marl. The other entered in the secondary filings in a way that took Fenn's clerk 5 weeks and a bribe to a records keeper to establish was C. Ferrers, widow. Rosalind read that filing twice and then laughed once, without any humour in it at all, because the whole architecture of the last 4 years had just rearranged itself in her head. Camilla Ferrers had not taken her husband. Camilla Ferrers had taken a signature. She had needed a titled man with an estate and no curiosity, and she had chosen the one within reach, and she had arranged for him to be 400 miles away and comfortable and increasingly in debt to her while the machine at home did its work. There were letters out of Mrs. Redfern's tin box and out of Marl's own office when the writ finally opened it, in which the two of them discussed the Duke exactly as a farmer discusses a gate. Keep him abroad through the audit. He asks nothing so long as the drafts are honoured. Ferrers herself, in her own hand in the December of the 2nd year, he is the softest instrument I have ever had the use of, and the wife, who is the only dangerous one, has been told nothing, and will be told nothing, since she has never in her life been in a room where anything was decided. Rosalind had that sentence framed. Not then. Later, years later, and not on a wall but inside a drawer, where she could look at it when she needed to. The escalation came in the 5th year, and it came, as these things always do, as paper laid on a desk. The Kestrel Valley Land Company gave notice to 11 Ravensmere tenants that their leases had been assigned and their rents would be trebled at Lady Day. 3 of those leases were the ones Rosalind had rewritten herself, and every one of the 3 bore her signature at the foot, in a hand so close to her own that she sat down hard when she saw them. She had never seen those pages before in her life. And on the same day, from the family solicitors in York, came a letter informing the Duchess of Ravensmere that an irregularity had been discovered in the execution of her marriage settlement, that the jointure might in consequence be void, that His Grace's affairs required the realization of certain assets, and that she should prepare to remove from the house at her convenience, but not later than the quarter day. That was the moment, Rosalind said afterwards, when she understood that she was not fighting a husband. A husband can be endured. She was fighting an eviction, engineered by 2 people who had counted from the very first evening on her being exactly what her husband had described through a library door, a woman who would not make trouble. She sat with those papers in front of her for 1 hour. Then she rang for Mrs. Redfern and asked for the deal box, and for Ardley, and for a horse to be got ready for the York mail. And she wrote to Elias Fenn a letter of 4 words which he kept for the rest of his professional life and left when he died to his partners in a frame. It said, "Now." All of it. There was one more thing in that bundle, and Fenn set it aside in a separate wrapper because he said a court would find no use for it. It was a letter from the Duke himself, written from Calais in the 3rd year to Marl, asking in the tone of a man inquiring about the weather whether the rents were holding up, saying that he found himself a little pressed and would be obliged for a further draft, and adding at the foot, almost as an afterthought, that if her Grace should require anything at Ravensmere she was to have it. Rosalind read that line 4 times. It was, as far as she could ever establish, the only sentence her husband wrote about her in 10 years, and he had written it to the man who was robbing them both. "He is not the author of this," Fenn said, folding it away. "He is the door they came in through. That is worse in my experience, and it is never punished. And you must make your peace with that now rather than in a courtroom." It took 11 months, and it was conducted, from first to last, in rooms with clocks in them. That is the part the ballads always leave out. There was no midnight confrontation, no slap, no thrown glass. There was a magistrate's hearing at Ripon in the March, at which Mr. Simeon Marl was committed for trial on 11 counts of forgery and uttering, and a summer assize at York, at which the case was heard over 2 days in front of a courtroom so full that men stood on the window ledges outside in the rain to hear it. Fenn had briefed a barrister named Sowerby with a voice like a man reading a shipping list, which turned out to be exactly the right instrument, because he simply put the paper in front of the jury in order and let it work. The bank's duplicate advices, produced by a thin young clerk named Gedge, who coughed twice and answered every question in 11 words or fewer. The Kestrel Valley Land Company filings, with both directors named aloud, and the small collective noise that went round that courtroom when the second name was read. The 3 forged leases, set beside 60 genuine documents in the Duchess'S Hound, and a writing master from Leeds who took 40 minutes to explain the 4 ways in which the forger had betrayed himself, the last of which was that he had copied a signature Rosalind had stopped using in the 2nd year of her marriage. And Mrs. Redfern's 41 letters read out one after another in Sowerby's flat, unhurried voice, until the phrase "the softest instrument I have ever had the use of" arrived in that room and settled on it like ash. Marl was convicted on 9 counts and transported for 14 years. Camilla Ferrers was not in England to be tried. She had gone to Boulogne in the February, 3 weeks after a letter from her own attorney warning her what the filings would show, and she had gone alone. And she had left behind at Dover a duke with a hotel bill, a mortgage on his life interest that he did not entirely understand, and a trunk of her clothes that she never sent for. The Duke of Ravensmere was not charged with anything. That is important, and Rosalind insisted on it. He had not forged. He had not stolen. He had signed a power of attorney in a stable yard, in a hurry to be gone, and had then declined to read 4 years of letters from his own steward, and the court said so, in language that a man's grandchildren can read in the county record to this day. The judge, in passing sentence on Marl, observed that the frauds before him could not have flourished for a single quarter in an estate whose owner had troubled to open his post, and that the negligence of a great proprietor is not a private failing but a public one, since it is always his tenants who pay for it. Gideon Devereux was in Calais when that sentence was pronounced. He read it in a 2-week-old newspaper in a coffee room, and a man at the next table, who did not know him, read the same passage aloud to a friend for the entertainment of it. Then Rosalind ended the marriage, which in that country and that year was very nearly impossible, and took the rest of the 11 months. The suit for criminal conversation went first. Undefended, the ecclesiastical court granted the separation in the November. And in the following spring a private bill was carried to the bar of the House of Lords. where the evidence was read aloud again in front of peers who had shot over Ravensmere as young men, and where the Dowager Duchess Honoria Devereux, 83 years old, stood up in black silk with her hands on a stick and swore to the settlements her husband's family had made, and added, when she was not strictly asked, that in her judgment her son had abandoned a wife who had kept his land alive with her own 2 hands, and that the name he had inherited would be better served by letting her keep it than by dragging her through another year of this. The bill passed in the June. Rosalind was summoned to appear once, and she did, and she was asked by counsel for form's sake whether she had ever put her case to her husband directly, whether she had written, whether she had begged him to come home. And the Duchess of Ravensmere, standing in a room full of the most powerful men in England, gave the answer that the county repeated for 20 years. "I did not write to him," she said. "He was not there to be written to. He had been gone 4 years by then and had sent word twice, both times to his steward and both times about money. I did not come here to be forgiven, and I did not come here to be pitied. I came to be finished." She was 37 years old. She went home on the York mail, sat down at her own table in her own house, and slept, Mrs. Redfern said afterwards, for 14 hours with the dog across the door. She married Nathaniel Kestrel, 6th Baron Kestrelmere, who had been Mistress Ardley for 6 years. In the small church at Nether Cray on a Tuesday in September, with the mill hands in the pews and old Hesketh from Marrow Inn giving her away, because her father was 3 years dead and had altered his will in her favour in the last month of his life, with a note that said only, "I was wrong about the 9 days." The Dowager came and wept and denied it. There was a boy the following summer and a girl 2 years after that, and the girl was christened Ivy, after a housekeeper, which the county thought eccentric and Mrs. Redfern thought about for the rest of her life. The mill took on 30 more hands. The 11 chimneys of Ravensmere were all of them lit that first winter. Every one, which cost a fortune, and was worth it, and the grey dog, stiff in the hips and white to the shoulders now, spent his last years lying in whatever room had the most people in it, moving twice a day with immense dignity, from the kitchen range to the library fire. Which brings us back to the wet October afternoon at the top of this story, and to a hired post chaise with an unpaid crest, and to a man of 50 standing in his own hall in the smell of sawdust saying a dead name into a room that had no use for it. It had all gone by then. The life interest was mortgaged, Camilla's creditors had found him in the 4th year, and the two of them had drifted back together near Ostend for the plain reason that each was the only person left who remembered the other in good clothes. He had come home, he said, because he had a right to be heard. He said a good deal in that hall, and to be fair to him, some of it was true, and some of it was even honest, which is rarer. He said he had been made a fool of. He said he had not known about the leases. He said, looking at the pipes stacked along the wall and the new glass in the gallery and the account books open on the hall table, that he saw she had done wonders with the place. And then he said the thing he had come 300 miles to say, which was that he understood he had used her badly, and that he was asking, not as a duke because he had learned what that was worth, but as a man with nowhere else, whether there might be a cottage on the estate. Rosalind came the rest of the way down the stairs. She was 42, with ink on her hand and a child's ribbon in her pocket, and she was not, anybody in that hall would have told you, the same woman he had left in the yard. She said, "There is no cottage. Not because I hate you. I have not hated you for a long time, and that is not a kindness. It is only what happens. There is no cottage because every roof on this land now belongs to a family that earns it, and because my children will not grow up watching their mother house the man who taught her not to speak at her own table. Fen will see you in York on Thursday, and there is an annuity, small, and it is the last of your father's money, and not 1 shilling of mine, and it will be paid quarterly for as long as you live, because your mother asked it of me, and I do not refuse your mother. And Gideon Devereux, who had rehearsed every face for this except the one he was wearing, looked past her at the old dog lying across a stranger's boots, and asked, in a voice that had nothing left in it, whether Bran was in pain in the cold. Some, she said. He broke that leg the night you went. He kept up with the coach for a mile. Then she said, and this is the part they still repeat in that county, you had 11 days, Gideon. That is how long he lay at the gate. I lasted a fortnight longer than the dog, and neither of us was waiting for you by the summer. You did not lose us in a night. You lost us the ordinary way, an afternoon at a time, while you were somewhere else being comfortable. He went out. The hound did not raise his head. Bran died at 14, in the spring on the flagstones in the sun, with the whole household finding excuses to walk through that part of the yard, and they buried him under the south wall where he used to lie when he stopped going to the gate. And years later, when the children asked their mother why there was a stone with a dog's name on it in the kitchen garden and no dates, she told them the whole of it, because she had decided early that they would hear the true version from her rather than a soft one from somebody else. She told them that a man had once said, through a door, that she was better with things that could not answer back. She told them that she had spent 11 years being agreeable and 4 years being exact, and that only one of those had ever changed anything. And then she told them the part she wanted them to keep. Your worth was never in being chosen, she said, and it was never in how long you were willing to wait. Love is not a debt that grows while you sit still. It is a thing that is fed daily, or it is not fed at all. Everything in this house that is warm, everything in these fields that drains, and every one of you, came out of the morning I stopped waiting at the gate and went round to the south wall where the sun was. The dog worked it out in 11 days. It took me a little longer, but we neither of us went back.